Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and today we've got a great subject to talk about. One that I know confuses a lot of people, and there's a lot of talk about, especially the last few years. Some people think of the subject one way, others think of it another way, and I have my thoughts. But today I have a great guest who's going to help us see through some of these clouds, Ken Simpson, who's joining us from Australia. And he's been around for, we'll just say a couple of years, Ken, in this industry. And how about you introduce yourself and let everyone know who you are, what you've done, and where you come from, and, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad you said just a few years. It means I don't have to dredge up long-term memories to introduce myself. Look, I've been in and around the risk continuity DR space for probably 30 years. And in that time, I've sort of been lucky in that I came into it like a lot of people via the IT path, but I routinely went in and out. And I think that sort of gives me different perspectives because I've never been a purely only done BC or DR person. And I've been fortunate enough to have roles like CIO and Chief Technology Officer and implementing major change programs. So I can bring a bunch of different perspectives to it. It's interesting on this resilience subject, and I'll continue to use the word resilience because it's the one most commonly used in this part of the world. I think it was probably back in 10 odd years ago when I started to write my blog, it was to explore this topic. And that's
for our listeners. For our listeners, what's the name of your blog?
It's called Contemplating, but I do everything under the branding called resilience.ninja, which is the domain name at the moment.
Great.
And that's actually where we first met, when you were blogging back in that era, and there's very few of us that were talking about this topic, and just became a natural thing to start to reach out to other people and talk and develop the ideas.
Mm-hmm, I remember that. So my first question for you, and it's a big one, and I'm sure everyone can guess what the topic is, resilience or resiliency. Ken, what is resiliency? There's so much perceptions about what it is and different viewpoints, and some are complete polar opposites of others. What is resiliency? In corporations, individuals, overall, what is it?
Yeah, I was sort of hoping for a couple of warm-up questions, but let's go straight for the big one. Yeah,
Look, go for the big one.
You're right. It's this hard concept because it is a concept, and we get the problem because we try to distill it down to simple, often simplistic dictionary definitions. But more importantly, as an industry, we try to distill everything down to an SKU. If we can't sell it and market it, then we struggle with it. So it's not a product, and it's not something that anyone can sell you. It's something you have to work on for yourself. So people will often talk about it differently between, say, individuals, organisations and communities, but it's always going to start from the individual and build out from there, because it's all about people. If you have a massive crisis and you put a bunch of no-hopers into your command and control, you will fail. Right? I don't care what kind of plans or anything you've got, you will just point blank fail. But if you put top-notch leaders in with bad plans, they have a chance of succeeding. You normally see that where you have top-notch leaders with no plans, and they have a chance of succeeding. So it's going to be distilling it down to people. And when we try to make the dictionary definitions, we make it harder for ourselves, because the word resilience or resiliency is used in competing fashions by different disciplines. So most of the ones you'll see to bounce back, the retain equilibrium after a disruption, are all from the engineering space. and they assume, they just assume equilibrium being reachieved, and these qualities of bouncing back. And you always hear about the rubber band. It's get its shape back, but I've never seen a self-healing rubber band.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So the rubber band, those engineering ones, only goes so far. If you go to the ecological space, where they're talking about resilience, in Canada, in the US, here in Australia, we have massive problems with bushfires, as we call them, or wildfire, as I think is the term you use in North America.
Yes, we do. We're having a big problem with that in British Columbia on our west side of the country now.
Yep. But if you go to a place that's been burnt out, massively burnt out, that will regenerate. It doesn't need humans to intervene most of the time. Nature can regenerate. And the ecological definitions of resilience have a lot more to do with adaptation than they do with rubber bands and restoring equilibrium. So if we want to get dictionary definitions, we understand where the terminology that we're using comes from and how it's intended. So I'm going to offer you a quote as a definition, Alex, and it comes from 2003 from Gary Hamel and Lisa Valakangas wrote an article called The Quest for Resilience in Harvard Business Review. And they talked about it as the ability to dynamically reinvent business models and strategies as circumstances change. Now, if we take that down to an operational level and say we need to dynamically reinvent how we go and do stuff, dynamically reinvent processes and rapidly moving resources around when circumstances change, then we perhaps have a better operational model of resilience that just sort of says it's not about disasters, it's about, Kodak as an example. They didn't see digital photography come along. Mm-hmm. Resilience isn't about disasters, it's about circumstances changing.
That's interesting because everyone in the business continuity disaster planning realm see it as the ability to, implement your plans okay, and off you're going again. Like, oh yeah, we're resilient because we made it through our sprinkler system going off or whatever.
Yeah, I know, but to some extent that goes back to my statement that we want to make it a product we can sell. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we forget that some of the biggest salesmen are internal specialist areas who are competing for share of budget. But I tend to take a lot of lead, I guess, from some of the work done in New Zealand at the Resilient Organisation School, and they've published a lot of material. And I can't remember which of their people, probably Erica Seville, who I have this wonderful quote that says, "Resilience is something you are, and business continuity is something you do."
I've read that one. I like that quote.
Yeah, and I think that's, there is still business continuity and disaster recovery within or underpinning the things that contribute to resilience. But at the end of the day, no amount of business continuity and disaster recovery is going to help some of those companies in British Columbia that have been burnt out. Wasn't going to help the instance post-Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. So we're always going to get something that goes beyond our assumptions. I mean, how many business continuity plans have you seen that contain the assumptions no rubble and no bodies?
Right? Yeah, just about every single one.
Yeah. So therefore, every business continuity plan you've ever read then didn't allow for a building to fall down or for there to be deaths. Heaven forbid that should occur, but it does. Yeah. And so in some extent, you might say resilience picks up where those other disciplines stop. And there's another big difference, I think, that, and this is a message that I use in my Resilience Ninja newsletter a lot, that resilience is a journey, not a destination. Mm-hmm. And in that context, we're never done. Yeah, sometimes we all have seen it, and as much as we rail against it, many organisations see BC and DR as projects. You do them, you tick them off, you're done, you move on.
Right. Making sure that you've got your audit all happy. Oh, you've got a binder sitting on a shelf or, on an online repository or something, and great, we're done now. Yeah.
That's right. And in the resilience space, that just doesn't happen because the world is forever changing. Your circumstances change. Mm-hmm. And so you need to read and respond, to adapt to whatever's going on in the world if you're going to continue to be resilient.
So it includes things like, business trends or business trends and public perceptions, where their thoughts are going on certain products and being able to adapt to those changes. Is that what you're talking about? In part,
Absolutely. A truly resilient organisation is able to adapt to changes in its business environment. I mean, we talk about business continuity, and when someone goes out of business, isn't that the ultimate failure of business continuity? Mm-hmm. Yeah, as Tim Arnott from the UK quite often says, isn't the hint in the name? Yeah, someone goes out of business for a strategic reason. We say that wasn't a failure of business continuity. Well, they stopped being in business. Yeah. So the strategic things need to come in. They have to be there somewhere. And I think that's a big shift from your business continuity can address all those operational level things and sometimes to the tactical level. But the strategic ones, we still need to bring in different thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So how does this relate to, how do I word this? I don't want to make anybody sound upset. If that's the real definition of resiliency, what is business continuity and disaster recovery not doing right when it comes to resiliency? What are they? What are they're thinking? Why are they thinking that resiliency is business continuity? Why the gap?
Look, I thought we were only talking for an hour, but if we've got all day, we could delve into that. Very, very difficult. I've actually been writing a series of blog posts recently under the label Days of Future Past, where I've looked at how different people over the past 20-odd years have suggested that we need to do things differently in the BC space. And almost universally, they talk about addressing more risks and threats and going into some more strategic areas in some respects, but also it's about bringing the practice into a relevance with some of where strategic executives need to look. So a lot of that is about just wanting to own the space. It's about how to keep positioning as things go forward. But at the end of the day, I really think the big promoter for resilience and why it's taken off with top management is because of the excessive focus on process and standardisation to the worst extent that's gone on in the BC space. Less so DR, that's always been heavily procedural and standardised because it doesn't deal with people that much. It's mainly with technology.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's interesting. With the gap that you talked about there between the two, and it does seem, it kind of leads back to one of the points you said that it's kind of like some people think resiliency is something you buy off a shelf. If you buy it off the shelf, well, then, this is my project, and I bought this software, or I bought this, services from some consulting firm or whatever the case may be. And if I do what they say, I can become resilient.
Correct. You can buy high availability in an IT space, but you can't buy resilience.
That's right. Yeah. And that, at least you're a great quote there earlier. Resiliency is what you are.
Yeah.
it's not something you buy off a shelf and think that after 6 months of sitting around the table and talking and writing a few things down, boom, we're resilient.
Absolutely.
It doesn't work that way.
Doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And it certainly doesn't work that way if we just do something and leave it sitting on the shelf after that.
Yeah, that happens with a lot of plans. I remember being in a place and a whole bookshelf was full of these white binders. One for this area, one for that area, and one for the third area. And I just kind of went, well, what are these? Who looks at these? And when I opened them up, they were 3 years old anyway. Yeah. And I kind of went, well, these are a waste of time. They're not going to help you.
But
they're out of date.
But you had happy auditors.
Yeah, that was the thing. There were no audit tickets. Audit was all happy because they could see a binder. And sometimes I don't think auditors really understand what it is they should be looking for. What it is they need, and they just see it as here's our line of what we want to see and the checkbox.
Absolutely.
And there you go. That's great. Well, on that note, we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back talking with Ken Simpson about resiliency. And join us. It gets even more interesting shortly, I'm sure. And welcome back to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today we're talking with Ken Simpson. We're talking about resiliency. And Ken, in our first segment, you touched on working in different realms and areas, and having different experiences. Do you think that's what makes a good business continuity practitioner? And
look, I'm a great believer that the way I put it to a number of people is, if you want to get on in business continuity, get out. Get out into a profit center, get out even into another loss-leading part of a business, get out and round out with some other specialist areas, so you start to cross-fertilize a lot of thinking. If you go back to how business continuity practitioners tend to conceptualize the strength and the core of the discipline, is because we tend to have a wide perspective of what goes on in the organisation. We see a lot of things. People doing even sort of very traditional ways of doing BIA tends to get you out there talking to a lot of areas of the business. And sometimes you find a lot of the vulnerabilities by being out doing that. So why doesn't it make more sense to go and flesh out that knowledge by going and working in some of those different business areas and starting to bring back different perspectives? I'm not saying give up on business continuity. I'm saying go out, learn about a little bit of other stuff, come back, and I think that will make you a much better BC practitioner.
I agree. We spoke with Sue Baker regarding project management. That turned out to be one of the key pieces that she mentioned too. If you want to be strong in business continuity, go out and do and get some project management skills, because it helps with stakeholder management. It helps bring all these different parties together, communications, governance. It helps you understand a lot more, and you get your fingers into more pies, so to speak.
Absolutely. And there's a very good example, Alex. Projects are the way things get changed in organisations today. And any way we want to build or enhance business continuity or DR, it will be done via projects. So we need to understand the core discipline of that. And business continuity, if nothing else, it is a program, not a project. And yet we quite often misunderstand program management here as doing the same thing year after year, when in actual fact it should be about having a blueprint of how we do things across a multi-year program of work.
Yeah, I agree completely. Okay, let's move to our next point, and one that I know you've written extensively about. And this is a topic, if people have listened to the last few shows, has popped up in every single episode. Lessons learned. Why do we never learn from our past mistakes? And Ken, I know you've written quite a few interesting articles about that. One in particular entitled "From PIP Alpha to Deepwater Horizon." Can you talk about our lessons learned and why we never seem to grasp that concept of learning from what we've done in the past?
Sure. I'll just. I'm not sure if people are aware. So Piper Alpha was a North Sea oil platform that was destroyed in 1988. So the analogy there is from 1988, fast in a North Sea oil platform with significant loss of life. You fast forward to Deepwater Horizon, and the same kind of thing occurs. So what is it about these things that we don't learn from to some extent? So there are two elements that I strongly believe. The first is most of the things that you read that are called lessons learned are not. We need to have a category of things called lessons observed. They are only learned when we change something to behave and preferably to think a little bit differently. I mean, I'm sure everyone's heard the quote, I think attributed to Einstein, and this is probably not the exact words, but we can't solve the problems we face today with the thinking that we used when we created those problems in the first place. Mm-hmm. So if we want to have lessons learned, then we need to take the observation and work out how we behave differently going forward, instead of just saying, a lesson I've learned is that I observed that this failed and I should have done this. And then we go and do the exact same thing again. And one of the lessons that we never learn, and in that post that you were speaking about, I've got a heading that says efficiency is the enemy of reliability. When there comes to quite often a decision between efficiency, which almost always gets translated as cost reduction, shedding fat out of an organisation, sometimes that becomes a greater priority than the reliability of it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we don't. Well, that's one of the strategic risks that people don't learn, that these things can't always be sheeted home to operate a failure when they're in actual fact systemic and structural problems of the way organisations go about prioritising efficiency versus reliability. And there's a whole school of thought in high reliability organising that talks again about culture and how cultures of reliability need to be built, not just cultures of cost reduction and staff shedding.
Yes, agreed. So with the see, now I'm saying it, lessons learned, and I shouldn't be, of course. The lessons observed. What do people need to do, or people or especially organizations, and using the Deepwater Horizon example and the Piper Alpha, what is it we should have done? After the first disaster, what is it we should have done so that we don't repeat those mistakes? What kind of things do we need to consider? It's not a lot of times, when disasters occur, it ends up being a finger pointing exercise more than anything else.
Yeah. Look, if it's very difficult, I think, to say what should we have done. I mean, hindsight's a wonderful thing. So after the UK issue, that was back in '88, they introduced a number of different ways that people wanted to look at safety issues. I mean, they had a massive inquiry into it. It's not to say there was any sort of shoddy work that came from it, and people probably did think they were learning. But 10 years later, we had a major problem here in Australia at a place called Longford, which was a gas plant, and it led to a massive disruption in the state of Victoria here. But that plant had implemented so much of the work that came out of the inquiry from the UK Piper Alpha. So, they'd introduced the safety case regime that came from there, but they still had failures. So I'm not sure that there's any. We would simply be making an observation there. To actually learn from that kind of thing would require a massive investigation and research, properly structured research into why these things go. what we see repeatedly is, I keep coming back to that same thing, it's the efficiency measures and the cost cutting that tends to happen around what those safety regimes were meant to do. You go and research the safety regime and the safety culture inside BP ahead of Deepwater Horizon. And they had a top-down, from the very highest level, top-down driven safety culture that disciplined people for driving cars without tops on their coffee cups so they didn't spill them. But yet they can still make the kind of mistakes that lead to massive impacts. So some of it is where we get to the point of trying to heavily proceduralize and processize things that we lose track of, but it's about the people and their behavior again.
Mm-hmm. And if you remove the people, well then, there is no behavior. Technology is not going to do the thinking for you.
Yeah.
At least we're not there yet, anyway.
That's right. And along with the lessons, the observed versus lessons learned debate, comes also the actual management of risk versus risk register management. The fact that I've got a risk register with 101 badly expressed risks and mitigations that have never been implemented, it doesn't mean I'm managing risk.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Okay. Can you think of any other examples, that with related to the lessons observed and things that you may think have gone well, or maybe an organization that has done well, learned from. See, I'm using that word. Learned from mistakes and have changed their behaviors.
Okay, we tend to mainly see reported the things that don't work. I mean, and again, it goes back to this philosophy, I guess. I'm arguing that this is a journey and it's constantly evolving. If you look at the success stories post Katrina in New Orleans, one of the well-publicized was the way Walmart responded. But yet today, Walmart are struggling big time. And they have some serious public relations problems. So they were able to do something in one instance and people used it as an example. But they possibly within their own organisation weren't extremely resilient, and the lessons they might have observed were not the lessons they needed to learn. The same. I wrote a contribution to a paper from the Risk Management Institute of Australia last year, just a chapter in the paper, and I used a case study of Lehman Brothers because that was another example of this where people have thought they were being resilient, but perhaps they weren't. Because Lehman Brothers, people might not know, were one of the poster children for success for recovery after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. And you could delve in and say they were maybe they were lucky, but anyhow, they were promoted around the world. In a particular IT company did a lot of promoting of it because it was their tool set that helped them achieve their results. And they were back up an improvised trading floor online within 48 hours of the attack, 6,500 staff displaced, really good news story for business continuity, in particular for IT disaster recovery. Fantastic. 7 years later, September 15, 2008, they filed for bankruptcy after the US subprime mortgage crisis. So, were they resilient? No. But they got lucky or had success in one space that didn't necessarily translate. And I think that's part of the whole issue about whether we're observing the right lessons sometimes and whether we're learning what we need to learn from those.
So with Lehman Brothers, does that, I know you said they weren't resilient. if a company is resilient, I guess they can lose it, right? With the people that come on board, they can have something great leadership or resiliency in place, and then it just disappears because attitudes change.
Yeah, and it goes back to another one of the statements or concepts that I like from the ResOrgs group that say that you have to always talk about resilience in context. So, yeah, Lehman were able to cope well with a physical disaster that also impacted a lot of the world around them, and they were resilient in that context. But they weren't resilient in some of their practices around financial risk and product risk, what they were exposed to in that subprime space. So, yeah, resilience in context, I think, is a super important concept to bring back to looking at what you need to learn and how you need to think about your own organisation.
Right. And maybe what they had, to your point, is they had some great plans in place, and maybe they did drills, to move staff and bring systems up somewhere else. But when it came to something that wasn't a physical disaster, something they could actually see and touch, all of a sudden they were just lost.
Yeah, and the latter problem was in some ways cultural, about here's an opportunity we can exploit to make a lot of money without necessarily fully understanding the risk profile of operating in that space.
Mm-hmm. They saw the dollar signs and chased after that. Possibly, I shouldn't.
Yeah,
I shouldn't
and
say
they
that.
were not alone.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Were there any others? Can you think of anyone else that's done that? I'm interested in hearing this. That companies' success stories that eventually weren't success stories.
You've caught me just trying to think about ones that are firsthand that I'm probably not at liberty to speak about, because therein lies our problem. It's only the spectacularly public ones that we learn about. The more mundane day-to-day things that we all experience, most organisations aren't willing to allow that to be explored and discussed outside their organisation, which makes it a bit difficult to have a lot of real quality, proper research that we can base these kind of decisions on.
Right. Makes you wonder, if you don't want to talk about it, are you hiding something? Was there something that, you don't want us to know, or, because that's what happens when you're talking with the media. When you don't want to give information, they start thinking, are you hiding something? So, I think it was Harold K. Drager, the president of the International Emergency Management Society, on our first episode, said, it would be great if some of these organizations and governments who have some of these situations shared the information. That's how we would all be able to move forward. But I guess that just doesn't happen, and I don't think, to your point, a lot of companies don't want to do that.
No, because it can make you look bad in the media and with analysts.
Yeah, and then you use your share prices, and you end up, it all comes down to the mighty dollar.
Absolutely, and that's what guys at that level are compensated and incented to not let happen. So that's their job, to not let that happen.
Right. Okay, and on that note, we have to take our second break. We're talking with Ken Simpson about resiliency, and we'll be right back. And welcome back. We're talking with Ken Simpson about resiliency. Ken, we've sent some messages back and forth between each other over the years, and I know there's one thing that you do want to talk about, and that's how we change people's thinking when it comes to resiliency. So, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, look, Alex, I think that's absolutely the key. When I first started blogging, as we said at the top of the show, there weren't that many of us out there, and and we were struggling with what the concept was. And like most people, I was at those purely operationalized definitions. How do I make this applicable in my BCDR practice? And the more I've delved into it, the more it's convinced me that it's all about culture and being open to embracing other ideas. And if I relate that change of thinking back to what we were talking about just before the break, is about if my current mindset can't let me learn a lesson, then I simply observe it and write it down, but I don't actually learn it because I can't learn it. My mindset won't let me learn it because my worldview tells me that this will never happen again. And we get to the whole argument that Taleb presents in making the case about black swans. So, for instance, a couple of years back, I think it was for BC Awareness Week, I did a webinar that talked about things like that. And I actually surveyed the audience to ask how many people had ever read any of Taleb's work and how many of them had only ever understood the concept of black swan by listening to what other people had told them about it. And it was like massive. Hardly anyone had read his work. And it is heavy going, I admit that. But the amount of people who talk about black swans and absolutely did not understand the concept and think that you can actually anticipate them and that they're missing the whole point. So we've got to, within the industry, we quite regularly don't even take the time to learn about a concept like black swan that we trot out and use all the time as a reason for why we should get more funding or do more work. So I think that the change of thinking is very much about opening your mind to other things. So I, a year or so back, or 2 years back now, started a podcast called Beyond the Black Stump. And the black stump is a concept in early Australian mythology, I guess you like. And it was a tool that people used to mark the edge of the surveyed or known landscape. They would simply burn a tree, basically blacken a stump, and that was as far as we'd surveyed. So it's a metaphor for the edge of the known universe and how if we really want to open our thinking, we need to go beyond the black stump, think beyond the known universe and the world we work within today. So we talked earlier about project and program management, absolutely critical to properly learn and understand for business continuity and disaster recovery professionals. But we need to learn and understand where those spaces are going. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been fortunate through the work I do to have spent a lot of time in the last couple of years working and practicing in organisations who are doing things on agile thinking, and there's a lot that we can learn in contributing to being resilient by adopting agile thinking and practices.
How so?
Well, if you think of it this way, I mean, this is a very simplistic telling of a story, but if we go into the project management space, let me see if I can tie a couple of these concepts together. If we go into the project management space, we have a huge problem with managing risk because we have to put all these plans in place up front, and so therefore we have increased uncertainty as we move forward. So we have to have risk management to manage that uncertainty. In an agile approach to that, you would only have sufficient documentation needed to get you started and move to the next major milestone or phase. Therefore, you've reduced the uncertainty by not having to plan, plan's the wrong word, but not having to plan and document everything up front. So different ways of thinking that say you don't have to plan everything down to the nth degree at the startup. Now, if we took that same philosophy and agile thinking and learning to adapt rather than follow a plan, doesn't that tell us that we're going to have organisations and business continuity teams and crisis teams that are better able to be resilient, to adapt to any change in their circumstances when they're learning to adapt, and their whole response and recovery mechanism is based on just enough planning augmented by the cultural and behavioural parts that let you adapt as the circumstances change. So it's thinking very differently, people-centric thinking rather than process-centric thinking, and thinking about, back at the top of the show, we talked about, resilience being different in individuals, organisations, and at a community level. If an organisation isn't becoming more like a community in some respects, then it's going to actually struggle a little bit on that resilience part, because command and control organisations are rarely resilient.
Mm-hmm. So
very long-winded answer to your simple question about thinking differently. Sorry.
No, that's fine. With culture, I'd like to just touch base on the cultural part. Are you talking about the organizational culture, like how the leadership feels, or the type of industry, or the location? Can you clarify what you mean by the cultural aspects?
Sure. Look, it's all of those things. I mean, if you look at one of the practices in the BCI's Good Practice Guide, talks about embedding BCM into the culture. And one of the problems we face quite often in the risk resilience in BC space is that we actually have no idea about what culture is. And so I'd advocate that that's another part of the thinking we need to go and learn about. And I wrote an article for Continuity Insights, I think it was, some years back, called Embedding Culture into Business Continuity, because until we do that, we're not going to get very far. So understanding what the culture of your organisation is about and how you need to interact with it. I mean, if you go into an accounting department, you expect, under the label of culture, we will have certain expectations about their willingness to take risks. The risk culture of accounting is risk averse. If you go into marketing, they're generally cowboys, and they're willing to take a few more risks. So it could be, as again, at a very base level like that says that these groups have different cultures around risk. They also probably have different cultures around process and documentation. And if I was to promote a conversation between those two groups about the one right or wrong way to do something, they're probably not going to agree.
So how do you bring them together? Because if you've got different thinking like that within the same organization, how could you get them on the same page, or ideas, whether it works or not, I don't know, but ideas to bring them onto the same page to help instill resiliency within that organization, if they're all going off in their own direction?
Yeah, look, good question. And I think that that's not going to be a successful area of practice for business continuity. When you want to change cultures or you want to shape culture, the CEO doesn't normally think of the BC guy as the place to go for that. They go to HR. So there was a major survey done here a couple of years back where a researcher went and spoke to, I think it was about 50 CEOs on the subject of resilience. And they all said that it was primarily a problem of culture and that the HR department was the place you would go to build this. And that came as a bit of a shock to business continuity community. So if we're going to attempt to address culture, we need to understand a little bit more about it. So even if we just learn enough to understand some of the elements, making cultural changes is a profound problem. And let's face it, if culture was easy to change, most organisations would be perfect today, wouldn't they?
And we know that's not true.
Exactly. So if you understand enough about it to try to find how you can bridge, because you can't get them all to think the same. So what is it that you need to bridge between these organisations? And does that mean to say that both a marketing department and an accounting department have to have the same structure and format of a business continuity plan?
So no cookie cutters.
Well, yeah, cookie cutters are great, but if you're making cookies, and it's not necessarily a useful tool in an organisational context when we've got so many different moving parts that do things in different ways.
So in essence, they can kind of, I don't want to say do their own thing, but have something developed for them to move each area to move forward differently, but together at the same time, as long as they're getting to do it their own way. That meets their cultural perspective and the way they do things. Right? It's meeting their need.
At the end of the day, we need to build capability to respond in organisations. The documentation of that, the structure of it, isn't what we're trying to do. Capability isn't a plan, isn't a document. It's something that people are going to be able to achieve with some help from some pre-planning and some thought. When we come to build capability in a department, that almost has to be aligned to that group and how they do their business. What's the one thing we hear business continuity people say all the time? I can't be held accountable for your plan. You have to write it yourself. That's the thing we say over and over, isn't it?
Yeah.
But then we say, but by the way, you have to do it the way I told you to do it.
Yeah, kind of contradictory, isn't it?
Yeah, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Either you need to learn a lot more about the organisation you're working with and help document their plans in a way that works for them, or you just accept that you're doing compliance-based, audit-based documentation, you're not building capability. Because again, capability comes back to how people are going to do the response and recovery, how they're going to read the situation they're in and adapt to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like anything. You could line 5 people up and show them a picture, and everyone sees something different.
Absolutely.
But it's the same picture. You can have the same fire in a building, the same car crash, or something terrible. But everyone's going to see something different. And respond differently.
Yep.
So, that's interesting. I do have another question for you. Can you give us a short version, just for anyone who might not know what this is? Can you explain exactly what a black swan is? Because I know you mentioned it a few times, and I didn't want to cut you off. And then, I thought, what if a bunch of people might not know what this is? Can you give us, a minute or two of a quick definition of what that is?
In a minute or two, it's okay. Look, the black swan. So it's a concept that was made popular by Nassim Nicholas Taleb in his book of the same name. Quickly, there are 3 things that would come with this. That it's a rare event, that it's beyond what we would normally expect to happen. It's a big, major impact thing, but more importantly, it's probably driven by psychological biases within the people to say it can't happen. It's not going to happen to me problem, and it can't happen because it's a logical fallacy driven from early European settlement. When they came to Australia, it's our fault, by the way, they discovered that we had black swans. And up until then, in Europe, they'd only seen white swans. So therefore, all swans are white. Therefore, there can't be such a thing as a black swan. It can't occur. And all of a sudden, they found some. So, yeah, a major incident that basically we psychologically believe can't occur. So we could never anticipate it.
Great. I had a feeling people might not know what that is. That's why I thought I'd ask you that. And on that note, we're coming to a close of another show. I'd like to thank Ken very much for his insight and his tips and commentary. Please check Ken's writing out. It's really good. I enjoy checking it out on Resilience Ninja. Am I saying it right?
Correct. Resilience.ninja is the URL.
Right. And check out the Beyond the Black Stump podcast on blackstump.fm. And this is another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.